It's Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And may I first of all welcome you back to your place in the chair today. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in wishing you and your family all the best. I know it's been a very difficult few weeks for you. Can I also thank the Backbench Business Committee for agreeing the application for this important debate, and to the Right Honourable and Honourable members who supported the application, particularly the members for Sutton Coldfield, Bromley and Chislehurst and Tottenham as the lead members. I would also just like to thank the families and campaigners on Joint Enterprise, known as JENGBA, many of whom are in the public gallery today, and who have never given up their fight for justice for their loved ones. So why this debate today and now? Nearly 2 years to the day since the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling that the law had taken a wrong turn, followed many years of campaigning with high-profile and seminal documentaries such as Common by Jimmy McGovern. But since that time, nothing of substance has actually changed. The campaigners leading up to that highlighted how, particularly in murder cases, secondary parties were too often receiving mandatory life sentences for lesser or no significant part in the crime than the principal, and that the evidential bar in many cases is much lower threshold than would normally apply to murder, particularly that those secondary parties might have foreseen the actions of others and not intended or have knowingly foreseen. At the time of the Supreme Court ruling, campaigners, parliamentarians and others viewed this ruling as a victory and had confidence that the injustices of the past would be put right and the use of joint enterprise going forward would be more limited. However, 2 years on from the Supreme Court ruling, and it feels increasingly like a Pyrrhic victory, with no case from the 30 years of the wrong law being applied having yet been awarded an appeal, and many new cases with all the hallmarks of the old cases being successfully prosecuted. Yeah, I shall give way to
Can I thank my honourable friend and congratulate her on this debate on this really difficult issue, which is not a small issue. Would she agree with me that 4,500 people are currently in prison, caught under the wrongful application of joint enterprise laws, men, women and children who are serving long sentences for crimes they did not commit?
I would fully agree with the point made by my honourable friend there, and in fact we know that it's at least that sort of figure, and we don't have the accurate figures. I'll give way briefly.
Before she moves on, would my honourable friend agree? Can I congratulate her on this debate? It is a crucial issue, and the newly formed all-party parliamentary group on miscarriages of justice has this as a high priority. But a particular case, Alex Henry, is of great importance because I also chair the Autism Commission, and there are several people in this predicament, this ghastly predicament, who are on the autism spectrum, and that has been totally taken out of account.
I thank my honourable friend for raising that particular case, and I know the family are here today of that case, and it has many of the hallmarks which we'll come on to discuss. So we are now seeing a new generation of joint enterprise lifers in prison. The Supreme Court said it was, and I quote, the responsibility of the court to put the law right. But many of us have come to the conclusion that the criminal justice will not and is not righting itself in relation to joint enterprise, and that we need to act. That's why MPs from across the House today have joined together so that we can send a strong signal to both the government but also to the prosecutors and others that the way we are continuing to apply the law and the incredibly high bar which has been set for the previous, I will give way in a moment, but for the previous unsafe convictions to be reheard needs redress. I will give way briefly to both my colleagues and I'll make it.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend and congratulate her on bringing this very important subject to the floor of the House of Commons. I've had reason to represent one of my constituents, J. Shrine Smith, who was convicted and sentenced to 31 years under joint enterprise. He was doubly punished recently because he wasn't allowed to go to his grandmother's funeral, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because Greater Manchester Police thought that he may become a victim of another gang. That was a double punishment. But isn't the real problem with joint enterprise that people are punished and sentenced to long prison sentences of over 30 years for actions that they didn't carry out themselves?
I would agree wholeheartedly with my colleague. I'll take one more intervention and I'll make some progress, if I may.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I just reiterate the comments, Mr Deputy Speaker. Very good to see you back in your place. Two questions. One following that has just been made by our honourable friend. If you look at the statistics, 37% of those who are serving long sentences for joint enterprise are black. That is 11 times the proportion of black people in the population. And also, if you're mixed race, similarly disproportionate figures, which I think underlines why it's absolutely essential that we have the review that my honourable friends called for in the motion today, which I fully support. But secondly, surely we are seeing a case, given the uncertainty here, where the courts are in effect acting as legislators. That is wrong. Where there's uncertainty in the law, it is for this House to tidy and clear it up, particularly when it is visiting injustice upon people in the way that we are seeing.
Thank you for that intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree with his sentiment, and I will come on to address some of that in my speech. So, with hundreds of what's known as lifers in prison convicted under what the Supreme Court viewed as a wrong application of the law, this is potentially one of the biggest and most widespread miscarriages of justice ever to face our justice system. And as such, I fear that the cosy club of the criminal justice establishment is closing in on itself to prevent this from fully ever being exposed. So what is joint enterprise? Joint enterprise has been applied in cases for over 300 years, although it is a common law which has never been passed by Parliament. The doctrine allows for more than one person to be charged for the same offence, despite the fact that they may have played a different or no role in the crime. Joint enterprise applies to all crimes, but in recent years it has been particularly used as a way to prosecute murder, especially but not exclusively in cases involving groups of young men. This is obviously a very emotive issue, particularly for families of murder victims, and no one is suggesting that those who commit murder or knowingly and intentionally assist in committing that murder should not face the full force of the law. However, nor should the evidential bar for serious offences like murder be lower by virtue of presence or association with the principal offenders, as we have all too often seen. Indeed, there are many cases, and I'm sure that many of these will come to light today, where people are serving life sentences when it is clear that they did not commit murder, but were found guilty under the old or wrong law of parasitic accessorial liability. Furthermore, many others were convicted as secondary parties, carrying the same sentences as the principal, based on a prosecution narrative of gang and association, even though intent and foresight are unproven, and where the secondary party was not physically present at the scene or withdrew from the scene. There is a further flaw in how this doctrine is applied, as has already been mentioned, when one looks at the profile of those convicted of murder. The majority are of black and ethnic minority backgrounds, and the vast majority are young, with many teenagers serving life for a secondary or parasitic role. I will say more about this as will others later, I'm sure, but we do have to ask questions about the disproportionate use of such doctrines within certain communities. There's also a political context here which is relevant to this debate today. I will briefly give way.
I'm so grateful to my honourable friend. Does she recognise that in those communities where 14, 16, 19-year-olds have gone to prison for significant time, when it's absolutely clear to the community that they've not committed murder, as in her community in Moss Side, what it actually does is it undermines the sense of justice system in the black community, less people cooperate with the police, less people have faith in the justice system, and it undermines all that she's attempting to do.
Yes.
A little bit, just to say. I'm hoping to give everybody 10 minutes. The danger is to intervene. I'm going to have to drop that immediately. Lucy Powell.
I do fully agree with what my honourable member just said there, so I will try and make some progress now. But there is a political context. There was a political context when this law began to be overused and extended in its use in the 1990s and the noughties. But there's also a different political context today. As my honourable friend has just said, we now more clearly understand the consequences of the disproportionate and unfair applications of the law against certain groups. And I was pleased to see that the government did recognise some of this when they, in fact, launched the Lammy Review, and also the Prime Minister's recent comments about the burning injustices. And I hope that the Prime Minister can live up to that rhetoric as well. But the practice and the law have been far too slow to catch up with this changing mood in the country. So I'm briefly now going to look at what the Supreme Court ruling did and didn't say, and what still needs to be addressed. Firstly, the ruling was clear that the law governing secondary liability had taken a wrong turn, and it had resulted in the erroneous application of the law. However, it also set out that in order for appeals to be heard out of time, a substantial injustice test, not the usual unsafe conviction test, would be applied. Yet the substantial injustice test was not clearly set out, and has never been set out by this Parliament, and has subsequently been tested through case law, and is now almost impossibly high bar for people to pass. That is why there has yet to be a single successful appeal awarded by the Court of Appeal nearly 2 years on. And thirdly and finally, in our opinion, the Supreme Court failed to address another question that was put before it, which is, does joint enterprise over-criminalise secondary parties? So what needs to change in the law? Firstly, what needs to change going forward? And secondly, how can we put right some of the injustices of the past? So going forward, what is clear is that joint enterprise continues to be overused and is disproportionately used against groups of young men, particularly those from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And I saw this firsthand at a recent case in Moss Side, where 11 young black men from the area faced charges of murder. 7 of those were convicted of murder and 4 of manslaughter, the youngest of which was only 14, and many of them were not previously known to the police. And as research by the Manchester Metropolitan University has shown in their study Dangerous Liaisons, over half of all of those serving joint enterprise life sentences are children or young adults, and over half are from black and ethnic minority background. I'm going to have to make some progress. I'm sure somebody else will give way later. Yeah. Their extensive research also found that the establishment of a gang narrative, which often relies on neighbourhood narratives and racialised assumptions, and by unevidenced constructs and loose associations and things such as social media tags and videos, have been critical to securing many of the joint enterprise convictions. And we know that there are serious flaws in this approach. This is why my honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, has raised this in his review, and the Home Affairs Select Committee is looking into it. Indeed, joint enterprise cases continue post the Supreme Court ruling, albeit under new CPS guidance, but I think that remains problematic. So, 3 areas we want the government to look at for future cases. Proportionality. And is this being used correctly, and is it being used disproportionately against certain groups? So we ask the government to do what the Supreme Court failed to do, which is establish whether joint enterprise over-criminalises secondary parties. Related to this, we need the data. This is urgent now, collating the data about who is being charged, who is being convicted and where. And this is long overdue. And finally, the long-awaited outcome of the review of the CPS guidance needs to be brought forward and quickly. And it must include clearer guidance for prosecution discretion so that lesser offences can be brought against secondary parties in many of these cases. So the final point I want to make is about the retrospective cases and putting right the injustices of the past. So we're not asking for automatic reopening of every single case. It's right that there must be a test, but this test is now so impossibly high that no cases have successfully been heard by the Court of Appeal, and the Criminal Cases Review Commission has yet to recommend a single case coming back, despite having received 99 fresh applications and reviewing 90 more. Indeed, appeal judges seem utterly dismissive of these cases. Unlike in a usual appeal case, where the threshold is the possibility of an unsafe conviction, applicants in the case of the wrong law of joint enterprise are also required to demonstrate that, as well as being unsafe, the correct law, they also have to show that there would have been a substantial difference to the outcome. In most other cases, this will simply be that there may have been done so. So we believe that this substantial injustice test needs establishing by Parliament in law, and it should make clear that the threshold is may and not would. Moreover, we think the appeal courts should be allowed to consider the ongoing effect of the conviction on the applicant and critically take account of the applicant's age, mental health and other vulnerabilities at the time, because the old or wrong foresight test, now applied correctly to adolescents or those suffering with learning or mental difficulties, would surely provide a substantial change to their conviction. And today, we would not expect an immature teenager or someone with learning difficulties to understand the old, weak foresight test. So I want the government to urgently consider a mechanism for clarifying the threshold about these cases. And just to be clear, this is not about reopening the floodgates, but if the law had been wrong for 30 years, during which time hundreds, if not thousands, of mandatory life sentences were handed out under this old wrong law, then it stands to reason that at least some, not a tiny, tiny few, of the cases are a clear injustice which the courts are currently failing to put right. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, we can all agree, I think, in here today, in this House, that the law did indeed take a wrong turn. Now that needs putting right. The establishment is evidently not putting itself right, so government and Parliament need to act. We urgently need a review of the use and scope of prosecutions brought under joint enterprise, particularly its disproportionate use against young and black and ethnic minority men. And we also need urgent clarification on the qualification for appeal so we can put right decades of substantial injustices and unsafe convictions leading to many serving life sentences for murders they did not commit. Yeah.